You know, I just got a text on my phone. I get texts from the Weather Channel. And there we go. And this is the latest text on the Weather Channel. This is an example of what we call natural evil. Millions of people won't have enough to eat after prolonged drought kills 1.5 million head of livestock and wipes out crops. So the question becomes, how can you believe in a just and loving God when something like that happens? That's the age-old question. It's been asked from the beginning of time. Okay? Now, we're going to dive into the Bible today. On the first page, I put down 10 observations that we can say are biblical ideas that come out of the stories from the section of the Old Testament that's known as prehistory. That is this Genesis chapters 1 till 11, starting with creation, ending with the story of the Tower of Babel. Okay? Right before Abraham is chosen and given the covenant. And by the way, the rest of the Bible, Abraham is given this covenant in chapter 12 of Genesis, and the rest of the Bible is how God fulfills that covenant. That's what it is, the whole story. All right, so let's just go through these observations that come from those stories. First, evil is the result of human alienation from God. In other words, in the story of Adam and Eve, it's not until Adam and Eve disobey God's command that they become afraid of God and hide from God, and therefore they're alienated from God. That was the result of their own choice. Okay, so according to the Bible, evil is a result of being alienated from our Creator. Number two, all people have the potential, therefore, to become evildoers. All right, so this is the doctrine of original sin. You've probably heard that before. Some people hate that doctrine because they think it makes people feel bad about themselves. But that's not what it's intended to do. It's not intended to make anybody feel bad about themselves. It's intended to inform us of the fact that given certain circumstances, anyone is capable of doing something that is not right. It's that simple. We're all capable of doing something that is wrong. Okay? So that's what it means. Number three, the potential to commit evil is an inherited trait. Okay? It's not something that we can escape. We're born with the potential to do bad things. It isn't possible for a human being to be perfect. It's not possible. All right. So we inherit it. That's original sin. That's what it means. And by the way, that idea, that wording, original sin, comes from St. Augustine, the theologian from the 5th century. He by far the most important theologian in Christian history. Okay, number four, the evils that exist in the world cause sorrow in the heart of God. Okay, now that comes from the story of the flood. Okay, God looked at the evil that was going on in the world and violence. He became sorry that he created the world and human beings. And as a result of his sorrow, God made the decision to wipe out his creation, except he would save just enough of a remnant so that he could start over again. That was Noah's family, the ark, all the animals, and so forth. So the idea there is that God is not the cause of evil. God is sorrowful because of evil, and he wants to do something about it. He wants to change it. He wants to redeem his world. Okay, number 5, the consequence of evil is death. That again comes from the story of Adam and Eve. When God warned them, if you disobey what I tell you not to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you will surely die. Okay, so death is, what's interesting about the concept of evil is this. Here's a conundrum for you. Suppose you're driving down the road, okay, and you hit a pothole. Bang! And it damages your car. That pothole, what is it? I mean, what is it? On the one hand, you'd have to say, well, it's the result of nothing being there. That's why there's a hole, because there's nothing there, right? On the other hand, it caused damage to your car. So something that is nothing causes bad things to happen. Okay, can you follow my reasoning here? Okay, evil by definition. So St. Paul struggled with this in his letters. When he was talking to, I think it was in one of the Corinthian exchanges. Some of the Corinthian members of that church were also worshiping in pagan temples. Okay? And Paul said 2 things about that are hard to reconcile. On the one hand, Paul said, well, they're worshiping gods that don't exist. So don't worry about it, because what they're doing is they're worshiping nothing. Because that God doesn't exist. So they're worshiping something that isn't there. But then in another part of the letter, he says they're worshiping demons. So how do you reconcile that there's a cause of evil? That's what a demon is, something that causes bad things to happen to people. But at the same time, it's also nothing. Okay? It's the same conundrum as if I had a hole in my shirt. That hole, on the one hand, is the result of fabric not being there. So it's nothing. But on the other hand, we don't say it's nothing, we say it's a hole. You see what I'm saying? Okay, so evil by definition leads to non-existence. All right? That's why the consequence of evil is death. Evil evil is destructive. The definition of evil is that it destroys. It leads to non-existence. Okay, and there's two forms of evil. There's moral evil and there's natural evil. What the Weather Channel just talked about is natural evil. Okay, there's been a drought for 3 years in the Horn of Africa. And because of that, there's been no crops and all their cattle are dead. So you've got 1.5 million people who could face a famine. That's evil. But human beings didn't cause it. Nature did. So we call that natural evil. On the other hand, during World War II, the Nazis murdered 6 million people. Okay, that's moral evil. Okay, but whether it's moral or natural, what's the result? The result is destruction and nothingness. It's death. Okay, so biblically, the perspective on evil is that ultimately evil destroys even itself. Because in the process of destruction, whether you call it a demon or nothing, no matter what you call this force that's causing all this destruction, once everything is destroyed, what's left? Nothing. So evil, in the end, destroys itself. It's like Adolf Hitler. What did he do when he knew he lost the war? He killed himself. That's right. Okay, so evil ultimately results in nothingness. Okay. All right. Number 6. There is a power of evil in the world that is stronger than the human will to resist it. All right. That also comes from the story of Adam and Eve. That's the snake. Okay. The snake is a representative of a power of evil in the world that we cannot resist. Okay, that's why there's so many stories in the New Testament about Jesus casting out demons. The meaning of those stories is that Jesus, who is God incarnate as a human being, has power over evil. And therefore he, and he alone, can free these people who are possessed by this power of evil. He alone can cast these demons out and free these people. That's what this means. Okay. So here's a perfect example. Why did Noah survive the flood? According to the story. The story tells us why. Why was Noah chosen to build an ark and be the sole survivor, him and his family, along with all the animals that came into the ark? Why him?
He obeyed God.
Right, exactly. The way the Bible put it is that he walked with God. Okay? So God is the only power that can keep people ultimately from being influenced by a power of evil that is stronger than their own will. So long as someone is close to God, you don't have to worry about a power of evil overtaking your will. Because God is strong. Okay, here's another example. When Jesus was tempted by the devil in the desert, remember the devil said, all these kingdoms belong to me. And if you bow down and worship me, I'll let you rule all these kingdoms. Okay? So at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, according to the New Testament, the devil had ultimate power over the kingdoms of the world. After Jesus rises from the dead, he tells his disciples, all power in heaven and earth has been given to me. Okay? So the resurrection, that is the opposite of death, evil caused death, right? When Jesus rises from the dead and overcomes death, he now has the power that previously the devil had. Okay? So, walk with God. Okay? That's my advice. If you walk with God, you'll be fine. Okay? All right. Number 7. God is eternally determined to overcome evil through love for humanity and his good creation. After the flood, God swore an oath to Noah. This was the first covenant God made. Covenants were agreements that God made with the human race. There were 4 of them. Okay, the first one was the one with Noah. God said, I will never do this again. I will never destroy the earth again. That was the promise he made. And what was the sign of the promise? The rainbow, exactly. Yeah. Okay? So God decided, okay, he's sorrowful over evil, but he is not going to deal with it by destroying his creation, because he loves his creation. So what that covenant means is that God made a decision, rather than destroy what he made because it became evil, he would redeem it instead. He would make it right. He would correct it. He would cast out the evil. He would overcome the evil. All right? And the prophets talk about this all over the place, whether it's Isaiah or Jeremiah or Amos or any of them. They all say there will be a time, and this is even the verse that's in front of the United Nations building in New York. There will come a time when they will beat their swords into what? Plowshares, exactly. Okay, what Isaiah was saying is that all war would cease, and instead people would produce food and therefore promote life rather than death. Okay, so the prophets talked about this again and again and again. So in the Old Testament, the promise of redemption is stated many times and in many different ways. We're going to look at one of them in the book of Job here, if I don't talk too much. Okay, that can be difficult for me. All right, so God made a decision that he was going to redeem creation. Okay, so that's number 7. God is eternally determined to overcome evil through love for humanity and his good creation. Number 8, God acts in history in order to bring salvation from evil through a chosen people. Okay, so the question becomes, okay, if God decides after the flood that he's going to redeem creation rather than destroy it, like he did previously, yeah. He's going to redeem it now. He's not going to destroy it anymore. How's he going to go about doing that? Well, the first thing he's going to do is choose a people. They're going to be the people of God. And it's going to be through those people that God is going to bless all people. All right? Now, reference Abraham. Abraham comes along right after these prehistory stories. This is the second covenant God makes in the Bible. He chooses Abraham for reasons we don't know, okay, but there's a lot of things we don't know about. God chooses Abraham and he gives him a promise, a threefold promise. Number one, your ancestors are going to be as numerous as the stars in the sky. Okay, so many, many people will descend from Abraham. Number two, you will possess a certain plot of land that will be yours forever. Okay, we know what they're talking about. He's talking about there, right? Okay, and thirdly, God says, through you I will bless all people. Okay, so those ancestors that God chooses, that all descend from Abraham, will be the people through whom God blesses all people. That's his plan. Right? Okay, and as the Bible unfolds, you see how all this works, right? First Abraham and Sarah finally had a son. They're in their 90s, okay? And finally they have Isaac. And Isaac has two sons. Now you got Esau and Jacob. Jacob inherits the promise. He has two wives. He loves Rachel most, but he was tricked into marrying Leah as well. And he has 12 sons, right? One of them sold into slavery because of sibling rivalry, okay? If the father favors one, and the rest of them get back. I can tell you all about sibling rivalry, all right? Even my two boys, there's sibling rivalry there, all right? So anyway, but what ends up happening as a result of that is that Joseph ends up becoming the most powerful person in Egypt besides Pharaoh. He invites the rest of his family to Egypt. They become numerous. They become 12 tribes. Now that first part of the promise given to Abraham has been fulfilled. He's got all these ancestors, all these people, but they're enslaved, right? So now God has to undo their slavery and bring them from Egypt to the land he promised to Abraham. That's the story of the Exodus. Okay, so you can see this promise to Abraham unfolding. And then finally, the blessing that blesses all people happens in the New Testament. Okay, the Old Testament, it's interesting. I'd like to talk to an Orthodox Jew about this sometime. But the Old Testament ends with these promises of redemption. But then it ends. There's no fulfillment. It just ends with the promise, right? Okay? Christians believe that the New Testament is the fulfillment part. Okay, the Old Testament carries the promises. The New Testament fulfills those promises because Jesus Christ is the Redeemer of humanity. Through his suffering, death, and resurrection, Christ blesses all the peoples of the earth. Now, what's fascinating about this is the way this unfolds. Okay, now this comes from Paul, not from me. Paul in Romans chapters 9 to 11. Okay, what's Paul's ethnicity? Jew. He's a Jew, right? And he's proud of it. In fact, he said, I was born a Pharisee, I obeyed the law to every jot and tittle of the law. We've inherited the promises. We've had the prophets. He's very proud of being a Hebrew, a member of the chosen people of God. Now he's agonizing over why God's chosen people rejected their Messiah. He's trying to figure out why that happened. How is it possible? And do you remember what his answer is? His answer is, because the Jewish people rejected their Messiah, the message of the gospel went to the rest of the world. In other words, the Gentiles were brought into and experienced this blessing that was promised to come through Abraham. Okay? Precisely because the Jews rejected Jesus, the gospel went to the Gentile world instead. So it was part of God's plan. It's part of the plan all along. Okay? According to Paul, God's in charge of the way things happen. Okay? It was no accident that the Jews said, no, this isn't the Messiah. Because Paul's thinking here is that had the Jews accepted Jesus as the Messiah, then Christianity would have remained a Jewish sect. It never would have spread to the Gentile world. It would have remained Jewish. And no Gentile would ever have converted to Christianity had it remained an aspect of Jewish religion. You see what I'm saying? Okay? So, one thing about Jews is, at that time, and I think today as well, they do not try and convert other people to their religion. They didn't then, and they don't now. Okay? Their thinking is that they're God's chosen people. And in order to remain God's chosen people, they can't accept anybody else into their fellowship, or their identity will be lost. Okay, here's an example of how that worked itself out in the biblical history. When the Jews returned to the Holy Land after the Babylonian exile, okay, Ezra and Nehemiah were the leaders. Okay, Ezra was in charge of making sure the people understood God's law. So he read to them the book of Deuteronomy. Nehemiah led the rebuilding of the temple, Jerusalem, the walls around Jerusalem, the holy city. Okay, the holy city was rebuilt, and Ezra told the Jews. Now there were a few Jews that remained in Palestine during the exile. The Babylonians allowed, if you were poor and you didn't have any power, and you weren't an important person, they didn't care. They just left you. Okay, so a few of them stayed, and they intermarried with other peoples. Okay, and some of them remained that way, and they became Samaritans, okay? So what Ezra did was he told them, if you married a pagan woman while the Jews were in exile and before they came back, you had to divorce your pagan wife and find a Jewish wife. Otherwise, we lose our identity, right? We just become like everybody else. The goal wasn't diversity, okay? That's America's goal. That wasn't their goal. Their goal is to maintain their identity as the chosen people. So you don't intermarry with... I had several requests throughout my career as a pastor to marry couples. One was a Jew and one was not. And they asked their rabbi or even just a reader in their synagogue to participate in the marriage, and they refused. They would not do it. And that's the reason why. They don't want intermarriage. So they had to put up with me. Okay, so number 8, God acts in history in order to bring salvation from evil through his chosen people. Okay, so that's the story of the Old Testament. I mean, it starts with the patriarchs, then there's being freed from slavery, then there's the journey through the desert to the promised land, then there's the book of Joshua where they conquer the promised land, then there's the, finally, the apex, the time when they're at their greatest was under King David. Why? Because King David united all 12 tribes and he conquered the entire land that was originally promised to Abraham. It was during, that's why David is so admired by the Jewish people, because he was the king who conquered and unified and also created a capital city, Jerusalem. Okay, that became the holy city. And he was going to build a temple. He wanted to be the one that built the temple. But remember, God said, you can't build a temple, David. You can't. Why couldn't David build a temple? He was a man of blood. He was a warlord. Yeah. He led armies and conquered land. That's what he did. And that's how the Jews ultimately expanded their amount of real estate they had. Okay? It was because David had an army. Right? And David, the Bible is very clear about why David was so effective as a military leader. Because the beginning of the story of David is David and who? Goliath. Here's a little kid fighting a giant, and the little kid wins. Right? Now here's a military leader. Right? So, but because he was a military leader, David, you can't build a temple. So that would fall to Solomon, David's son. And Solomon, interestingly, the Bible is so full of ironies, okay? David's sin was that he saw Bathsheba bathing on the roof of her house. And, oh my, he liked what he saw. So he's the king, okay? He commands everybody. So he has somebody go tell Bathsheba to come to him. And of course she obeys. He's the king, right? And then he gets her pregnant. Now he knows he did something wrong. So he's going to try to hide it. By the way, the nature of evil is that it always tries to hide, right? What do criminals do after they commit a criminal act? They hide. They run away. They don't want to get caught. Okay, that's the nature of it. All right? So David wants to cover up his sin, which was adultery, and stealing another man's wife. So what he does is he has Bathsheba's husband come back from the Israelites are at war, right? And Uriah, Bathsheba's husband, is in the army. He's fighting David's war. This is how bad this gets, okay? And David has Uriah, he tells his general, tell Uriah to come home. What he wants to do is make it look like Uriah is the father of the child that she's pregnant with. But it doesn't work because Uriah tells David, while my comrades, your people, are at war, I can't be having pleasure with my wife. So he wouldn't do it. Now what's David going to do? He can't hide it now because Uriah won't cooperate, okay? So he tells the general, put Uriah at the front of the battle, because he knows that if Uriah's at the front, ultimately he's going to die, which he does. Okay. That's how bad this got. Okay. This is the most admired king of Israel. All right. So, but the irony of this is that ultimately, okay, the child that that she bears dies. Okay, God told David that this child isn't going to survive. Okay, so this child dies. But David now has her as his wife because Uriah's dead. So he has her as his wife. And he gets her pregnant again. And she delivers a son. What is the son's name? Solomon. So when David is in his old age, close to dying, and he has to designate an heir to be the next king, Bathsheba comes to him, and of course, she's his favorite. She comes to him and says, you have to designate Solomon as the next king. And that's how that happened. So, the point of this story, as I see it anyway, is the same point that was made when Joseph was sold into slavery, right? That was an evil act that ultimately ended up bringing something good, because it resulted in Joseph's family becoming 12 tribes and surviving in Egypt. Okay, so ultimately that evil led to something good. And ultimately David's sin also led to something good, because Solomon became the next king. And what was Solomon noted for? Yeah, he built the temple. He was noted for wisdom. Solomon was the wise king. All right, so Orthodox Jews think that Solomon wrote the wisdom literature that's in the Bible. He wrote it all. Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Job. These are all compositions of Solomon because he was the wise king. So how does God deal with evil? Well, God deals with evil in a lot of different ways, but one of the ways that he deals with it is that God is able to bring good out of evil. Okay, so evil acts can ultimately end up causing something good. It's not always, the story doesn't always end in a bad way. All right, number 9, the story of God's intervention in human history with a view to saving creation began with the Abrahamic covenant. We already talked about that. Number 10, the entire story told in the Bible is the account of how God brought salvation to God's people. All right, now, okay, so we have chosen people. They're in the land of promise. All of these promises, except the one about blessing all people, have been fulfilled. It's happened, right? Abraham's descendants are numerous, and they possess the land. We're there now. But the question of evil doesn't go away. People still have to find an answer to it. And the reason for that is because for the Jews, it was absolutely essential to believe that God was just, that God did not allow bad things to happen to good people. That is injustice. So they had to come up with an explanation for evil. Because evil happens to everybody, right? I mean, in the last 5 years, just as an example, my car was stolen. And it happens. Bad things happen, right? Thankfully, we haven't had a bad earthquake here since I moved here. So I haven't experienced natural evil. When I lived in North Dakota, we had occasional tornadoes, but not when they had. Oh, we had a flood. Yeah, that destroyed our house. My dad had to rebuild the whole house because the water, back there they have basements, right? Every house has a basement. Well, the water filled the basement and about 4 inches of the main floor. So that meant that the entire basement, the floor, and all of the drywall had to be torn out and rebuilt. So, yeah, that was an interesting experience. All right, so the Jews have to come up with an explanation for this. Why are these things happening? If God is just, why are these bad things happening? Okay, so explanation number 1 is the doctrine of retribution. That's what the book of Job is about. Now, the doctrine of retribution is an attempt to preserve the idea that God is just. In everything that God does, it is just. It's not unfair, it's not evil, it's not bad, it's the right thing to do. So if evil happens to somebody, what God is doing, number 1, is, okay, he's punishing sin, but that isn't God's ultimate goal. God's ultimate goal is to get that person to repent and return to fellowship with God. That's his goal. Okay? Now, the book of Job is exactly about that idea, the idea of retribution. So, in short, Okay, Job is a guy who's righteous, described as the most righteous guy in the land. Okay, he never does anything bad. Then he experiences various forms of evil. His family is wiped out. His fortune is wiped out. All of his cattle are, there's both natural disasters, and there's thieves, and there's murderers, and it's just awful. In the end, Job loses everything. To the point where his wife says, Job, why don't you just curse God and die? That's how bad it was. Even his health, he was covered with boils. I mean, it was just awful. 3 of his friends come to Job. For 7 days, they just sit with him because they're so disturbed and feel so bad for what he's going through that they just want to support him in his suffering. So they just, sometimes, I'm sure you've all experienced this. Sometimes, when someone is in deep grief or sorrow, all you can do is be with them. That's all you can do. You can support them. You can tell them, I'm praying for you. You can remember them with cards. You can visit them. You can, but you can't take away their pain. You just can't. It isn't possible. So that's what Job's friends. But then finally, after 7 days, remember 7 is a sacred number for the Jews. It means complete because creation took place in 7 days. 7 is a symbol for a complete period of time. All right, so after the 7 days are over, Job's friends start to talk to him. And basically, all 3 of them offer this argument. Job, you must have done something wrong, okay? Or this wouldn't have happened to you. Because God is just. God would not have allowed you to suffer like this unless you did something wrong. So what God is doing, ultimately, is He's causing you to suffer so that you will repent and return to God. So God's ultimate aim in causing bad things is not to be unjust, but to be just and merciful. Because He wants to bring people back into fellowship with Himself. Remember what the prophet Joel said? We read this every Ash Wednesday. Return to the Lord your God, for He is loving and merciful, and blah, 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 blah. Okay. So that's the message of these 3 friends to Job. You must have done something wrong. So why don't you just repent, and God will forgive your sins, and you'll probably regain your health, and things will get better for you. Job refuses. He says, I did not sin. I did not do anything wrong. I'm not repenting because I have nothing to repent for. So there's this argument that goes on for 38 chapters. This argument with these 3 guys arguing with Job. Finally, God speaks at the end of the book of Job. God speaks. Okay? And what God says is, Job, were you present when I created the universe? Can you tell me how it is I laid the foundations of the earth? Were you there when all the stars shouted for joy? Do you understand why there's all this animal life all around you? Do you understand any of that? Well, obviously he doesn't. Because he wasn't there at creation. The point God is making is that things happen that we are not capable of understanding. And evil is one of those things. Okay? God allows it for reasons that we cannot comprehend. That's the message of the book of Job. So it doesn't give an answer, except to say, bad things do happen. Sometimes they happen to good people. But we still believe that God is just, even though we can't understand why these things occur. Why did that tornado destroy that town in Kentucky? Why did those people have to go through that? Can you imagine? You got 2 kids, and you're hiding in your bathroom, and all of a sudden your house is blown apart. I mean, that's evil, right? Or when Katrina hit New Orleans, and all those people flooded, that's evil. Bad things happen. Natural evil. Moral evil also happens. Okay? So, last week I talked about, remember in the 19th century, people thought that human beings were progressing. Everything was getting better because through science, we were beginning to understand disease. We could inoculate people from getting smallpox, polio, and surgeons were learning how to do surgeries that would extend people's lives. Everything was getting better. Tyrants were being thrown out. Democracy was being established. And a middle class was emerging. More people had more wealth than in the past, when all the wealth was in the hands of a few. In the 20th century, unfortunately, people gave up this idea of progress because there were 2 world wars. So people decided, my goodness, humanity is not getting any better. If anything, we're getting worse, right? Because never before was there concentration camps with ovens designed precisely to kill people. I mean, obviously, we're getting worse rather than better, right? Well, the Jews realized at a certain point, I'll let you read that in the lecture. They realized after the exile, and they returned back to their homeland, under Greek rule, they began to realize that this idea that suffering was caused by God as a punishment for sin, that's an explanation that did not work. And the reason it didn't work was because the Greeks tried to force the Jews to become pagan in their religion. They outlawed the practice of observing the Sabbath, the Passover, all the elements and the foundation of Jewish identity was outlawed. And they tried to force them to become pagan in their religion. Okay, so the Jews resisted. They wouldn't do it. So that resulted in a lot of them being executed. And so there was a lot of suffering on the part of the righteous, while those who went along with this pagan idea, they were rewarded. So obviously, this idea that suffering is caused by a person doing bad things, that explanation just doesn't work, because it's the righteous who are suffering and it's the unrighteous who are being rewarded. We got to come up with a new explanation. All right? And that new explanation comes in the book of Daniel. And that's where we'll start next week. Okay?